The wind howled like a starving beast across the endless stretch of the high desert, sweeping snow in wild spirals that erased every trace of man or beast from the land. The mountains crouched like ghosts in the distance, their peaks hidden beneath thick veils of storm clouds, and the only sound, besides the wind, was the distant groan of frozen trees, breaking under the weight of winter. Somewhere between the edge of the frontier and the heart of nowhere, a lone rancher named Cole Denton struggled against the storm, his horse trembling, his fingers numb on the reins. He had ridden too far chasing a stray calf that had wandered from his herd, and now, with night falling and snow deepening, he realized he was lost. The land he thought he knew so well had turned alien under winter's fury. His breath came out in clouds of steam, his beard was crusted with ice, and the cold had crept into his bones like a slow poison. He thought of his ranch's little cabin with its flickering fire, the smell of hay, the old hound curled up by the hearth, and cursed himself forever. Leaving it this morning, the horse stumbled, snorting, and Cole dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the drift. He led the animal forward, hoping to find shelter, a ridge, a cave, anything that could shield them from the wind. But the storm only grew worse. The horizon disappeared, the stars smothered, and the white fury of nature swallowed him whole. That's when he saw her. At first, she looked like a shadow in the snow, something that didn't belong, a figure crouched by a fallen tree, her dark hair whipping in the wind. She wasn't wearing the heavy coats of a settler, only a blanket of animal hide draped around her shoulders and thin leather, moccasins on her feet. Cole blinked, thinking his mind was playing tricks on him. But then she lifted her head, and he saw the fierce, calm eyes of an Apache girl staring back at him through the storm. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she rose slowly, like a spirit called from the land itself, and pointed toward the trees behind her. Cole hesitated, unsure if she was leading him to shelter or danger. But the cold made the decision for him. He followed. They trudged through the drifts, his horse struggling behind, until the girl ducked into a hollow where a cluster of rocks broke the wind. There was no fire, only a small space, a patch of bare earth beneath a leaning boulder, where the snow couldn't reach. The girl crouched there again, wrapping herself tighter in her hide blanket, and looked at him without a word. Cole tried to speak, his lips numb, his voice cracking. "You'll freeze without a fire," he said. But she only shook her head and pressed a finger to her lips, motioning for silence. He didn't understand until the wind shifted and he heard it, the distant howl of wolves. They were close. The scent of smoke would have drawn them like death. The girl's eyes held his, calm and steady, teaching him without words what her people had known for centuries. Sometimes survival meant surrendering comfort to live another day. Cole unsaddled his horse, covering it with his blanket, and crouched near her, trying to make sense of this strange protector in the night. Her face was calm, unreadable, her breath steady, her hands clasped loosely in her lap as if the cold didn't touch her at all. Hours passed, the night deepened, and the cold bit into his marrow. He shivered uncontrollably, watching frost form on his sleeves, and thought he wouldn't last till dawn. But the girl moved closer, silent as a drifting flake, and without hesitation, she placed her hands over his, pressing warmth from her body into his frozen fingers. Her skin was rough from the wind, her palms warm and alive. She whispered a word in her language, something that sounded like nada, meaning warmth or life, and leaned her head back against the rock, eyes half closed, breathing slow and deep. Cole watched her, half in awe, half in confusion. She seemed to draw strength from the cold, as if she belonged to it. He wondered what kind of life she had lived, what stories lay behind those calm, dark eyes. As the hours dragged on, he couldn't keep his eyes open. He dozed and dreamed of firelight, of his ranch, of the sound of cattle lowing in the morning mist. And when he woke, the storm had passed. The sky was pale gray, and the sun fought weakly through the clouds. The girl was already standing, brushing snow from her shoulders. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks red from the cold, but her eyes were bright and alive. She gestured for him to follow again. Cole's body ached, but he obeyed. They walked through the hushed wilderness, over frozen creeks and through stands of pine glazed with ice, until they reached a ridge that looked down on the valley. From there, Cole could see the faint trail leading back toward his ranch. He turned to thank her, but she was already looking at him with a strange expression, a mixture of pity and pride. "You go," she said quietly, her voice low and accented. "Your fire waits." He stared at her, surprised she spoke English. "What about you?" he asked. She shrugged. "My fire is here," she said, touching her chest, and smiled faintly. Then she turned to leave, vanishing into the trees like smoke. Cole stood there for a long time, watching the place she'd disappeared, until the wind shifted again, and he felt the world come back to life around him. He mounted his horse and rode home, his heart heavy but changed. He had met many people in his years on the frontier, but none like her, an Apache girl who slept in the snow without fire and survived. That night, as he sat by his own hearth, the flames dancing warm and golden, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen something sacred out there in the wilderness, something old, enduring, and free. He looked at the fire and realized he had taken it for granted his whole life. The warmth, the comfort, the security, all of it felt different now. He had learned that there was another kind of strength, one born not from tools or shelter, but from spirit. And as the night deepened and snow fell gently outside, he whispered a quiet thank you to the woman who had shown him that truth. Spring came slow to the high desert that year, crawling out from the frozen ribs of winter like a wounded animal, trying to breathe again. The snow melted in fits and starts, rivers of icy water cutting through the hills, and the world began to show its colors once more. Green blades pushing through the frost, buds trembling on branches, the call of wild birds breaking months of silence. Cole Denton worked his ranch in quiet solitude, but his thoughts were never far from that night in the snow. He saw her in his dreams sometimes, the Apache girl with fire in her eyes and winter on her shoulders, standing in the wind, calm and wild, unbroken by the cold. He had returned to his old life, feeding cattle, fixing fences, living in the same small cabin he'd built with his own hands, but something inside him had shifted. He found himself listening to the silence more, respecting the land rather than fighting it. And yet, there was a hollow space inside him that no fire could warm. One evening, while checking the southern boundary of his property, he noticed a small trail of footprints leading down toward the creek. They were light, deliberate, and barefoot. His heart kicked in his chest. Following the tracks, he came upon her again, kneeling by the water, washing her hands, her hair loose and glimmering in the fading light. For a long moment, he just watched, unable to believe she was real. When she turned and saw him, she didn't flinch. Her eyes softened, and she gave a small nod, like she'd expected him all along. "You found your way," she said quietly. Cole smiled, unsure what to say. "Seems you were the one who found me," he answered. She tilted her head, as though weighing his words, then looked up at the sky. "The cold is gone," she murmured, "but another kind comes soon." He frowned. "What kind?" She didn't answer, only stood and motioned for him to follow. Together, they walked through the trees until they reached a narrow clearing where smoke curled faintly from a circle of stones. It wasn't her fire, he realized, but the ashes of one. Nearby lay the remains of a small camp, woven mats, dried herbs, and a deerskin pouch. She had been living close all this time. "Why stay here?" he asked. "Your people?" She shook her head. "Gone east. Soldiers came. I stayed." Her voice was calm, but the sadness beneath it ran deep. Cole felt a tightness in his throat. He had heard rumors of soldiers moving Apache families off the land, driving them to reservations far from their mountains and memories. "You could come to the ranch," he said, surprising himself. "There's work and food, and I could use another pair of hands." She studied him carefully, as if deciding whether he meant kindness or pity. Finally, she nodded once. "For a little while," she said, "until the wind tells me go." That night, she came to his ranch, silent as dusk. The old dog barked once, but then wagged his tail, as if recognizing her spirit. She moved through the cabin with quiet curiosity, touching the wooden beams, the saddle by the wall, the little clay figure he'd carved years ago. Cole made her stew from venison and beans, and she ate with small, deliberate bites, her gaze steady on him the whole time. They didn't speak much. Words seemed too heavy for the air between them. Over the next weeks, she became part of the rhythm of his life. She rose before dawn, tending the animals, gathering herbs from the hills, mending what was broken. She worked with a grace that made every task look sacred. Cole tried to teach her small things, the way to use a branding iron, how to fix a broken stirrup, but more often, she was the one teaching him. She showed him how to read the wind, how to sense rain in the distance, how to find water by the way plants bent their leaves toward the sun. She spoke of her people's ways, of balance and listening, of taking only what the land was willing to give. And sometimes, when the nights turned cold again, she would sit by the open door, looking out at the stars, her voice soft as the wind. "Cold teaches," she said once. "It makes you small, but it makes you see." He never forgot that. As summer neared, a new kind of storm came, not from the sky, but from men. One afternoon, a group of soldiers rode up to his ranch, their boots clattering, their rifles shining in the sun. The leader, a tall officer with cold eyes, asked if Cole had seen any Apache fugitives in the area. Cole felt his stomach tighten. "No," he lied, his voice steady. "Ain't seen a soul but cattle." The officer stared at him for a long time, then tipped his hat and rode off. When Cole turned back toward the barn, she was there, standing in the shadows, her face pale but calm. "They will come again," she said. "You should not lie for me. You saved my life," he said quietly. "I owe you more than a lie." Her eyes softened. "Then listen," she whispered. "When the cold comes again, remember what you learned. Not all fires are safe. Some burn too bright." He didn't understand what she meant, not then. That night, she packed her few belongings. He tried to stop her, but she only smiled. "You have fire," she said, touching his chest. "Now you don't need mine." At dawn, she was gone. The hills swallowed her like mist. Cole searched for days, but he never found her trail again. Years later, when the winters came hard, he would think of her, how she had slept in the snow without fear, how she had shown him that strength wasn't in fighting the cold but in understanding it. And when he taught his own children to build fires, he always said the same thing: "The flame will keep you warm, but respect the cold that taught you to make it." Sometimes, on clear nights when the stars shone like ice, he swore he could see her, silhouette on the ridge, watching over the valley she once called home. And in those quiet moments, he'd whisper into the wind, "Thank you," because some lessons, he realized, don't end, they live on in the people they change.